All right, so we've looked at how to determine a predetermined overhead rate for an entire plant where we use one overhead rate. And then we've also looked at establishing different departmental rates for overhead when cost drivers vary from one department to the next. In our example, I believe we had a machining department and our cost driver was machine hours. Kind of makes sense. But then over in assembly, we didn't have any machine hours. We had only direct labor. So for the machinery or the machining department, our predetermined rate for that department was machine hours, and then in the assembly department, our predetermined rate was direct labor hours. So that's actually harder than what we're going to talk about right now. So when we talk about unit costs in a job order costing system, it's pretty simple. If we want to know what our unit cost is, we take our total product cost divided by the number of units. So really the only thing that we want to make sure that we do correctly here is there's two things. We want to make sure that we include only product costs here in the denominator. That's direct materials and direct labor. And then the other thing is the third component of product cost is overhead, manufacturing overhead, factory overhead. But we want to remember that it is applied overhead based upon that predetermined rate that we calculated before. And so whatever this figure is, we're just going to divide it by the total number of units. So let me just give you an example here. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. But let's just say that we had direct materials of, I don't know, 75,000. And let's say we had direct labor of 70,000. Okay, so now we're up to, 145. And then let's just say that we had manufacturing overhead of, let's go with 80,000. Okay, so total product costs were, I believe I said $75,000 for direct materials, $70,000 for direct labor, and we applied overhead of 80,000. That's not necessarily what actual overhead was, but we applied overhead at a rate of 80,000. Okay, so let's just suppose that for those product costs we produced 5,000 units. We can establish our per unit cost at $45 per unit. So not exactly rocket science, but nevertheless a concept that we probably need to know how to do. So we have an example of that right here. Now this is for a specific job. What I gave you was maybe an example of multiple jobs over the course of a month, but here is a specific job, and we're gonna keep this kind of simple. We're gonna say that the job name is simply backpacks, and that this job was started on January the 3rd and completed on January the 29th. So there's probably, when we look at this example here, it doesn't mean that they were working non-stop on this for 26 days. They may have worked on this, that's about a 26-day period. They may have only worked on this for 2 or 3 days, or maybe 5 days for a few hours to get this job completed. And so we have our direct materials here, $1,000. Our direct labor was $1,080, and then again applied overhead $240. So our total cost, our total product cost, not just total cost, but total product cost is $2,320. We made 20 units. So these are some pretty nice backpacks because our unit cost is $116 per backpack. So the kind of hypothetical on the fly example that I gave you on the previous slide using the calculator maybe would help look at all of our job order cost sheets over the course of a month. And then this one here, this is a good example for a specific job, one of perhaps many that we're going to complete, or at least try to complete over the course of a month. The job order cost sheet is absolutely a subsidiary account of the work in process account until such time, of course, that it's completed. And then we're going to move the item into finished goods. So what we're saying here with this comment, just to make sure we understand this conceptually, when we think about our balance sheet for a manufacturer, when it comes to inventory, on that balance sheet, we're going to have a value for our raw materials, which makes sense. And then I want to skip past work in progress for a moment, or work in process just for a moment. And we're also going to have a value for finished goods. These are items that are ready to sell but have not yet been sold. But right there in the middle is work in process. So we had, just prior to that job order cost sheet that we looked at in the previous slide, at some point, for example, we hadn't put quite the full $2,320 in there. It's reasonable to assume that at some point we had maybe $1,500 of costs in producing these 20 backpacks, and that the job was not complete. So let's think about this. If we are looking at the balance sheet and we see work in process has a value of, say, $200,000, we're saying that the work in process account is made up of multiple job order cost sheets that are not yet complete. Okay? So it says the more and more jobs that are produced, a company will usually find it convenient to number these jobs. In the example that we looked at, it was not numbered. It was just simply labeled backpacks. And so if we have one or two things that we're working on at a time, that's probably okay. But if we have a large number of jobs that we are trying to complete at any moment in time, yeah, we definitely need something more than just labeling them as backpacks. We already said that work in process consists of all incomplete work. That's okay. We could say it again. And what that means is jobs that are not yet finished. So we think about that per unit cost that we had for the backpacks. Well, we established that per unit cost most accurately when the job is completed. Okay, so that was an example from my perspective. That was an example of a completed job order cost sheet. And then I also told you about this. I gave you the example. It says the balance in work in process at the end of the month will be the total of all the job order cost sheets for incomplete jobs. So I gave you the example. The balance was $200,000, and I said it could be made up of lots of little $1,500 jobs, $1,600 here, $3,000 here, and so forth. Also on the balance sheet, we're just trying to make sure that you have a good foundational knowledge of this process. We looked at the job order cost sheet, which had that was kind of our final tally of all of our materials, all of our labor, and all of our applied overhead. But we use a materials requisition form essentially to move direct materials out of the materials warehouse to the assigned job. So I want you to think about it like this. Let's say that we have a warehouse that has total materials of, say, $500,000, and we request, let's just say, $2,000 worth of materials to complete a certain job. They give us an example here of buckles. Let's see here. Well, okay, let me back up. It looks like our job is briefcases, and the materials that we're requesting is are buckles. So at this point in time, we fill out this materials requisition form, okay, and we transfer these 10 buckles over to the production area. We're going to now say that materials in the warehouse are no longer 500,000, but they're 500,000 minus 30, which is still almost right at 500,000, right? Yeah. So what does this $30 become? That goes on to the job order cost sheet as materials, which is going to be reflected on the balance sheet as work in process. So let's just say that we had no job started and we had $500,000 worth of materials. All of it was in the materials account. We had no work in process, no finished goods. We make this requisition. We now have $499,970 in materials, and we also have $30 in work in process. Okay, now work in process is not just made up strictly of materials, of course, but that gives us a little insight into that account. So materials requisition form. This is how we move materials from raw inventory materials, raw materials inventory over into work in process. A time ticket works the same way, except that a time ticket is for direct labor. Now, direct labor is not stored in a warehouse, but you recall the job that where we made the backpacks, we had a final cost for direct materials, we had a final cost for direct labor and applied overhead. Well, we have an employee here, looks like he worked, let's see here, throughout the day. He worked on 2 different projects. He worked on backpacks and briefcases. This 2 hours here, this 1 hour here, and this 4 hours here, that's 7 hours of direct labor that ultimately are going to flow through to that backpack job. And then he also has 1 hour that he spent on the briefcases, probably something to do with those buckles. Okay, so this time ticket feeds in, or the cost from this time ticket feeds into the appropriate job order cost sheet as direct labor cost. And so kind of a little summary here of this. Is probably the last video, or I'm sorry, the last slide in this video. This basically shows us everything that we were just discussing. We have a materials account. When materials move out of materials, they move into work in process via the materials requisition form. Okay, so we have materials. We request the materials to become part of production. They flow into work in process. The same thing is true for the labor time tickets. This direct labor cost flows into work in process. And then we use our predetermined overhead rate based upon direct labor hours, or perhaps machine hours, whatever the case may be, and applied overhead also moves into work in process. When the job is complete, I'm not sure why we're zigzagging like this, but we move the completed goods, we transfer those out into finished goods, and that's where they will stay until they are sold. So all of this here is taking place just as it says on the balance sheet. When the goods are sold, finished goods is going to go down, and cost of goods sold over on the income statement, which is an expense, is going to go up. Do notice here that we have selling and administrative expenses, which we are required to list on our income statement for GAAP. But notice there are no connecting dots anywhere around this little box here. And the reason for that is these are period costs and not product costs. All right, that's it for this video.